Being able to understand Marx's critique of classical political economy and capitalism requires a firm grasp of the concept of the commodity as Marx outlines it. Marx intentionally starts out Capital, generally known as his most developed work, with an analysis of the commodity, which rests at the heart of the capitalist mode of production. Marx dissects the commodity to reveal its complex nature and its connection to the social relations embedded in capitalism as an economic system. What is a commodity? It is difficult to define what a commodity is according to Marx because, as we will see, there are many critical parts worth noting. Marx does not provide a comprehensive, condensed definition of the commodity. Part of the reason why he does not do this is because the commodity existed outside of the historical period of capitalist development, and as such took on different, albeit less important, roles in social and economic relations. Of course, Marx was primarily concerned with the commodity as it came to be in the capitalist system. Let's try and deal with some of the mystery surrounding this concept of the commodity by considering a simple and general maxim regarding the commodity. The commodity must fulfill a human want or need. The product of any labor that does not meet this basic criterion cannot be traded and thus bears no value. We will explore this concept in greater detail a little later on. Basically, a commodity must be valued within society in some way. It must have value. Well, what is value? Can we see it? Can we measure it? What defines value? Marx points out that there is a common denominator to all commodities. They are the products of human labor. They all contain a certain amount of congealed labor, which he ultimately labels as the determinant of value itself. In other words, commodities all hold some quantity of labor, and that labor gives the commodities value. Marx isolates the exchange of commodities as the point at which we can see how labor, in a very abstract manner, takes on its role as a source of value. So, all commodities' values are, as Marx puts it, congealed homogeneous human labor. Marx talks frequently about this notion of concrete and abstract labor. To put it simply, concrete labor is the labor that actually happens on the factory floor. It's the hammering of the nail, the welding of the metal, the stitching of the shirt, etc. But abstract labor is a little more tricky. Here Marx is talking about the fact that when we exchange commodities, in acknowledging equivalence between qualitative differences, that is, the differences between the bottle of wine and the 3 metal hammers, we are actually also acknowledging the equivalence of the quantitative magnitude of labor embodied in the commodities themselves. When a bottle of wine is traded for 3 hammers on the market, the labor used to produce those commodities is treated as universal labor, though a single hammer might not have taken as much socially necessary labor time to make. And don't worry, we will return to this term later. We know that after enough hammers, we can eventually get our bottle of wine. And in the market, we can supposedly do this with any commodity, exactly because they are all made up of that wispy, abstract, and homogeneous labor. You're probably thinking, hold on, we don't trade commodities for commodities anymore. And you're right, of course. But what Marx is doing here is building his argument, which requires many steps and thousands of pages before it reaches its peak. For the time being, rest assured that Marx spends a great deal of time talking about the role of money as a universal commodity that works as an equivalent for all other commodities. Back to the discussion of value as congealed labor. It would be wise to consider the term homogeneous carefully in relation to labor embodied in commodities. Marx is not in any way implying that all labor is the same labor, qualitatively or quantitatively. In fact, Marx talks specifically about the different variables involved in defining labor, such as skill, intensity, time, etc. Undoubtedly, 3 hours of skilled labor at high intensity is bound to produce more value than 3 hours of unskilled labor at low intensity. But much like in the example of the bottle of wine and the hammers, given enough products of the unskilled labor of low intensity, you can eventually accrue as much value as is in the products of the skilled labor of high intensity. This is what makes labor homogeneous. Human labor is equatable at the point of exchange. Before we discuss value even further, let's consider a final problem with Marx's assertion of labor as a source of value. Consider the situation in which it takes a potter 10 hours to produce a single bowl by hand. It takes another potter 8 hours to produce a single bowl by hand. Does this mean that the first potter's product has more value than the second one? Marx says no, this would not be the case. What determines value is not the individual labor input into a commodity, but the socially necessary labor time needed to produce that commodity. In other words, if, given the average amount of skill and the standard production facilities of a particular society, it takes 9 hours to produce a clay bowl, then the value of all bowls will sit roughly at the 9 hours labor mark. What this means is that the first potter produces bowls slightly slower than the social average, whereas the second potter produces bowls slightly faster than the social average. This does not affect the value of the bowls they produce, but it does affect the amount of bowls the potters can produce in a week. Considering a 12-hour workday, Potter 1 can produce 6 clay bowls a week. In the same time frame, Potter 2 can produce 6.7 clay bowls. After a month, the more efficient potter will have produced over 2 bowls more than the first potter, meaning he will have more bowls to sell. See how even after a month of work, a 2-hour difference can put one potter ahead of the other. These differences become especially pronounced with the advent of industrial technology, which allows some companies to outproduce others by large margins. We will see in future videos how a capitalist that stays ahead of the socially necessary labor time can make large profits compared to his or her competitors. Finally, let's touch on the concepts of use value and exchange value. To put it briefly, use value is the physical attribute of the commodity itself, that is, the commodity's ability to fulfill a human desire or need. Exchange value is not physical at all. It is the value as expressed by exchange itself and is measured by that abstract labor we talked about earlier. A good way to differentiate between the two is to remember that use values differ in quality, while exchange values differ in quantity. Think about it. The quality of a chair, its appearance, its use, the material it is made out of, is entirely different from the quality of a lamp or the quality of a cup. However, when considering their exchange on the market, the only difference between these commodities is how much labor is embodied in them. Hence, use values differ in their quality, while exchange values differ in their quantity. Notice the interesting relationship between value, use value, and exchange value. They all make up the commodity itself. They are, at the same time, exclusive of each other and intrinsically related. They cannot exist without one another, but they are totally different. This observation is a perfect example of another pillar of Marxist thought, dialectics. Dialectics go beyond the scope of this video, but consider the relationship between the different concepts of value Marx introduces. Value cannot exist without exchange, as we've seen. At the same time, if something is valueless, it cannot be exchanged. And naturally, neither value as a whole nor exchange value can exist without a use value. A commodity must have practical attributes in order to be exchangeable and in order to hold value of any kind. Ultimately, what we see is that value is not a static or universal concept. It is in constant motion, defined by labor and exchange. This sense of things being in a constant state of motion hints again at Marx's dialectics, which sees the world as one that is constantly in flux. This concludes the first video on the commodity according to Marx. There's surely more discussion to be had. In fact, most of Marx's analysis of the capitalist mode of production can be traced back to the commodity. In particular, Marx focuses on the conditions of production, the social relations, and the economic forces that revolve around the commodity. We have yet to discuss the peculiar role of commodities in the capitalist era of history. Marx eventually takes his methodical dissection of the commodity and provides us with some interesting food for thought about the implications of commodity production in capitalist society. We will consider these issues in future videos. Until then, thanks for watching.